So it turns out, Joe Bulig, that Obsidian is actually pretty cool. Who knew?
Oh, how did I know that this was potentially going to be a thing that came up today?
Now, I should say, well, by the time this goes live, I probably will be completely switched over. As of this moment, I am not 100% positive that Obsidian is going to do everything that I need it to do. I am 99.5% positive it will. And you helped me overcome two big obstacles in the last week. One of them was figuring out how to recreate my cross-reference library, which is not the same way because Obsidian does not have block references. They have block embeds, which means that you cannot go to a block and see everything that's connected to it. You cannot reference the other pages from said block, but you can, if you know someone like Joe who has scripting experience, break apart all of the Bible verses by individual verse and end up with 30,000 text files that will accomplish roughly the same thing. So
31,090 to be exact.
But who's counting? Yes. So thank you very much for your assistance with that. Now I have to drop everything in. I've done a couple months worth of sermon notes and it seems to be working. I think this is going to be what I wanted in the first place. And then the other thing which you helped me with, I'm sorry it took so long, but I was trying to figure out a way to back stuff up, and I found this Obsidian plugin for backing up to GitHub. I know nothing about GitHub. I know nothing about command line, terminal, etc. So I naively messaged Joe and said, hey, do you have a few minutes to help me set this up? And then we ran into problem after problem after problem. And 2 hours later, you had helped me connect Obsidian to a GitHub repo, and now Obsidian is backing up automatically and beautifully. So I owe you lunch, coffee, many other things.
I will say, whenever you messaged me about the Git thing, in my head, I was like, okay, there's a couple things I know he's going to want. He's going to want it to be in a private repo, and I'm guaranteeing he doesn't have SSH keys set up, so we're going to have to go through that process. I know he's got a brand new computer. There's probably going to be issues with that. There's probably, I knew a lot of this was going to happen before I ever said yes. So I was aware. And anytime you're installing something brand new via command line, you're always opening up the door for potential issues. And I will say that I did run this in its entirety on my machine before I ever said yes to you. That's the part that's hilarious to me, is that I set it up on my computer in my systems. 3 minutes, I think, is what I set it up in. And then it took 2 hours on your computer just because all the stuff wasn't set up on it. But I knew that. So I'm glad it works. I'm glad you are down the path of heading into Obsidian. I will have to figure out what to do with my bell now. Do I need to get it out just in case? Maybe we should make it the Obsidian bell now.
Yeah, you could do that.
Great fun. Well, I'm glad you've made that decision. I'm glad Obsidian is potentially what you need. And I'm glad that we were able to get 31,000 text files made.
Yes. Yeah. And there's a
great fun.
There's a bunch more. I mean, that's just the Bible verses. And then I've got 3 years worth of notes that I've got to connect and all of the files that are associated with that. I mean, I'm learning more about how Obsidian works, and I'm kind of concerned that I'm going to break it, but so far have not. We temporarily broke it when you were sending me the finished zip files with all the individual text files, and we throw it at Obsidian, and then it's loading the cache for 2 hours, but eventually it caught up.
I did run across a thread on their forums that someone was asking, it's like, what is the max number of notes that it can handle? And somebody was talking about throwing 1 million text files at it to see what it would do, and it seemed like it did fine.
Well, maybe I'm good then. I don't know.
I don't know. That seemed like it was a lot. Now, they had a use case where they had like some programmatic generation of text files that was going to happen. So they were generating 1,000 plus a day in some form. I don't know what that was, but Mosquito has a good question, though. You could make separate vaults.
You could, but then you can't connect things. So I don't want separate vaults. I've never understood why, like in Rome, you can have separate graphs. And I'm like, but these are all my ideas. Why would I want to separate them? Other than when I was trying to do the bookworm stuff and create a separate graph for that, you only have the option to share an individual page or share the entire vault. So I'd set up the second one and just share the entire vault. Although Obsidian Publish is very nice. That's going to be way better once I get that set up. Just give me some time, folks, to get it all over there. I actually am paying for Publish already, so we'll have to figure out. I know you can do like custom URL stuff, so we can actually just like tack it on to the bookworm.fm URL if you wanted to, but.
That sounds interesting.
That's a discussion for another time.
It's true. But in the midst of all this, I'm grateful you've started the transition to raw files. That's my real excitement for you.
Yeah.
Because like in my case, I had a whole bunch of notes that I was using with NV Ultra. I'm kind of playing around with making a switch over to Obsidian just because NV Ultra is taking so darn long to release, and I'm getting tired of waiting. So I've been trying to find a tool that does a lot of what I want it to do and uses a lot of the same hotkeys and stuff. And Obsidian lets me hack a lot of that stuff. So I've rewritten the vast majority of the hotkeys that are in it already. So we'll see. We'll see what comes of that. If I stick with it or not, who knows? I dabble with a bunch of stuff. So I've got mine in Sublime Text, NV Alt, NV Ultra, Vim, and Obsidian right now. I'm a mess.
Plain text files, though, so you can do that.
It's true. And I can have them all open at the same time.
Yep. All right, enough about Obsidian and fancy apps. Oh, actually, one more thing I should mention to you because you'll find it humorous. Okay. You were helping me with this stuff, and Rachel was popping in and out, and I was explaining what you were helping me do. And in the evening, she's like, "So let me see what this looks like." And I showed her like what I could do with connecting the verses using the references and the graph view and all that kind of stuff. And she's like, "Blah blah blah, nerds."
100% yes, exactly. That is exactly the right response to that.
Yeah,
that's hilarious.
All right, so we got a couple of action items here. I put this one in. I'm not sure if you actually published this or not. I'm not sure if you forgot about this because you actually have completed it already for yourself, but how's your Kanban board coming?
Yeah, it works well. This is in OmniFocus. I've been using it pretty regularly. I publish it on GitHub. I haven't done a write-up on my blog about it, and I'm not sure I'm going to because I'm not sure that it's a good fit in this case because I've got a lot of OmniFocus stuff on there lately, and I'm trying to break that up slightly. So it's on GitHub. I can get you the link to that one specific, or you might already have it, Mike. But it's pretty straightforward. It takes all of the scripts that are on the OmniFocus plugin directory of sorts on the Omni Automation site, and then I just tweaked it to run on projects instead of tasks. Made a custom perspective, boom, done. That's the way it works. So yeah, it's done. I've been using it pretty regularly. I like it. I'm a fan.
Cool. Well, we can link to that because we got some nerds who listen to Bookworm 2 who might be interested in that sort of thing. I do not have access to that yet, but I'll dig it up for the show notes.
Oh, real quick. One more thing on that. I did a guest episode on the Automators podcast where we were talking about OmniFocus automation, and that particular plugin and such that I had done came up a lot, along with a whole bunch of other stuff that I've done with OmniFocus. So if you're interested in that and you're listening right now, go check out the Automators podcast.
Very cool. All right. So my action item was to make morning time my writing time. I have basically been successful in this. I've been intentionally procrastinating, for lack of a better term, on anything not writing related, and this is going pretty well. Part of this is the new and shiny of checking out Obsidian, which actually I really like as a writing tool. I think maybe all my writing will happen here instead of Ulysses, but I'm not 100% sold on it yet. I do like the fact that basically it's always auto-saving. Now it's automatically uploading everything to GitHub every 5 minutes. And it's got like the character and the word count, which is really the only sort of statistics that I was after anyways. And it's all plain Markdown. So when I'm done, I can just copy paste into WordPress without any of the crazy stuff that Ulysses does to like images and footnotes and all the other stuff.
Yeah, I don't know that I haven't committed to it, but the fact that I can just tick an icon and it goes from edit mode to preview mode makes me like I ran my stream on this past Monday. I normally have an outline with notes and stuff for it that I write in Markdown, and then I usually pull it up in Marked. And I would normally write it in Multi-Markdown Composer. Well, this time, just to find out, I wrote it all in Obsidian, and then I just ticked the box, changed the view a little bit to hide all the sidebars and stuff. And it seemed to work just fine for me. So maybe I'm consolidating 3 tools into one. I don't know that I like that.
Sure.
We'll see.
Yeah, the preview is pretty nice. And actually, if you hold down the command key and you click on the preview, you open it in a second pane and then they're linked. So as you're editing in real time, it's making the updates in the preview, which I know Marked has something similar, but I believe it's got to be saved.
Sure.
And I like not having to hit Command S. In fact, I tried BB Edit for a little while, forgot to hit Command S and lost a whole bunch of writing.
Not good.
Because for a while I was just dumping the notes inside of Obsidian, then you can open in the default app. So BB Edit was my default app, and I really do like BB Edit. Maybe there's a setting in there where it auto saves. I'm not sure. I don't know. I'm still figuring out what the specifics of this workflow look like, but Obsidian is great for writing, and I realize that a lot of my ideas end up being turned into some sort of writing anyways. So I like being able to have all that stuff inside of one application. Makes the workflow a little bit more seamless.
Sure.
And Hook is awesome and it integrates with Obsidian, and I am just scratching the surface with what you can do with that stuff. So
yeah, Mike's referring to Hook Productivity.
Yes,
that's a really cool tool that lets you hook in like get URLs and such to link documents, pictures, text files to websites, and like it's kind of nuts. Just hit a keyboard shortcut and you can see all the links you've got for whatever it is you're looking at.
Yeah,
it's bonkers.
It's an impressive app. But enough about impressive apps. Let's talk about mental models, shall we?
Sure.
All right. So today's book.
Great segue. Well done.
Today's book is The Great Mental Models, Volume 1 by Shane Parrish and Rhiannon Beaubien. And this is a book that is published in conjunction with the company Automatic, the people behind WordPress. The basic idea behind this book and the others in the series is that you have these models that you base your thinking and decision making on, and if you understand the models, maybe you can make better decisions. That's kind of the whole point of this first section here on acquiring wisdom. And then there are 9 different mental models that they get into. There are 3 supporting ideas, which basically happen after each 3 chapters or something like that. And I love this approach. I bought this one and the second one when I saw them available in hardcover on Amazon. I've been keeping my eye on this ever since it was recommended in the Bookworm Club probably 2 years ago at this point. And the hardcover you could not find. You could get the ebook version. I didn't want the ebook version. And so the hardcover, I checked a couple months ago, it was available on eBay for like $150 for a acceptable condition book. And I'm like, no way. And then out of the blue, they became available again. So I bought them. Mine is printed right side up, unlike our buddy Josh's.
Yeah.
Sorry, Josh.
just to point that out, Josh, our friend of the show, Josh Wrench, sent us both this video of him flipping through this book, and it was printed upside down and backwards. Like, okay, well, I guess that's small printing. It happens. So I know that he got it swapped out. So it's all been fine.
That's good.
Since, but
yeah, that's bizarre. Never. Yeah, I don't know how something like that happens.
I know, right?
But that aside, I think this is a really cool concept. And this first volume is kind of like the general principles. And then the second volume gets into like science and math, things that I'm not really that interested in. I will tell you though, after reading this one and seeing kind of the purpose behind the models that they're presenting, I totally want to read all the other ones. I don't know if we'll cover the second one for Bookworm. It's quite a bit longer than this one is, but I am definitely going to read it. I love this approach. It's basically condensing stuff that we would probably read whole books about. In fact, in some of these, we have read whole books about them. And they condense it down. It's very visual. They tell cool stories. I mean, this is my jam right here.
Did you just give away your rating?
Maybe.
I think this is especially this first section because he does a very good job of laying out the intent, the background, the why for this book. And I'm grateful for that because it has a lot to do with what is it we're trying to accomplish here. And that is ultimately, how do I acquire wisdom? How do I get smarter as a human? And how do I think about things? And yes, we're going to go through each of these mental models. We'll see how many or how long we spend on each. Hopefully it's not forever and always. But I do think, one thing that kind of stood out to me, in the religious world that you and I come from, Mike, a lot of times whenever we think of a mental model, we don't call it that. We call it a worldview. And that was something that struck me fairly early on. It's like, I'm not sure there's a direct correlation between those, but from a Christian perspective, that having a worldview is something that we've talked about pretty regularly. It's a fairly common discussion point. And I approached this kind of with the mindset that these mental models could be seen as a way to view the world. However, I don't think that holds up 100%. Because again, that was my expectation going into this. Once he started explaining what are mental models, especially once we got into the first one here, it made me realize no, it's kind of more a way of thinking about a specific situation or different methods of thinking about situations or decisions that you're trying to make or understand, as opposed to an all-encompassing set of glasses that you see things through. So I don't think it's a true correlation. I just thought it was kind of an interesting connecting point. And that's how I got started in the book, is with that point.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's not a worldview per se. It's a set of tools that you can use to think about things in a specific way. But you don't always view things through the lens of a specific model. Let's just jump into this first chapter here on acquiring wisdom, because this is where he starts to talk about what mental models really are. So they're a representation of how something works, and it is a lens. So I guess you could, in some way, say, yeah, it's a worldview. But you collect these lenses, and the more lenses you have, the more reality you understand, and the more you know what to do with it. But you have to use the right lens on the right situation. And so what this book is trying to do is give you some tools in your mental toolbox, and then it's up to you to figure out when to apply which one. Is that fair, you think?
Yeah, I think so. Because it's ultimately, when do you think about using one of these? Later on we're going to talk about Occam's razor.
Yep.
So, well, that's just a tool that you can use to help make a decision as to which route to take, or which is the most likely reason for something that happened. And I will say, and I'm not going to spend much, if any, time on this. We've had some very tragic recent events in my little town, and it was kind of interesting to come at some of the conversations and relationships that I have with some of this in mind as a result of that. For those of you interested, there was a shooting and bombing in my little town of Buffalo, so that's kind of raw on my mind as we're going into this. Again, I'm not going to go into details with that, but it is just a thing that made me stop and pause. It's like, my original assumptions, given these mental models, were they true? My initial thoughts with all of that, was I correct or not? Probably not. Here's why. And now I have a kind of a way to define it in terms that I can use to explain it a little bit.
Yeah, that's kind of the point, is that you have something that you can use to explain things and unpack things. He mentions at the end of this chapter, by the way, that the more you use these models, the more you understand when to use them, which means there are times to use them and times not to use them. You have to understand the models, and you have to actually apply them in order to get the benefit from them. And the other thing I think that's worth noting here in this first chapter is that all of the models are flawed in some way. So you have to use them in the situation in order to mitigate the flaws. So if you use something in one situation, that flaw doesn't really matter. It's going to provide you the benefit. But if you use it in a different situation, that flaw gets exposed, and it's pretty easy to see, well, that's not helping me see things right in this situation. So that's the background of the entire book. Let's get into the meat of this book, which is the great thinking concepts. There are 9 of these. We're going to go through these, I think, pretty quickly. Famous last words.
How many times have we said that?
Yeah.
We're going to run through these quick.
The chapters themselves are pretty short, and so there's not a whole lot in terms of the material in the book to spend a ton of time talking about, but there are concepts here that we've come across before that there have been entire books written about that are very lengthy. So the first one is the map is not the territory. Basic idea here is that the map, or what we think of in terms of the landscape, is very different than reality. And that could be a map in like Google Maps or Apple Maps, and it doesn't have the street on there that you need to turn down. But there are many other scenarios where this takes place. One example of this they mentioned is stereotypes. Stereotypes are a form of a map. And the danger here, and the reason for this mental model, is that we forget that the territory is actually much more complex than the map itself.
Yeah, I think the way to see that is that you have to consider that a map is a simplified version of reality. And if you take the stereotype piece that you brought up, like, yes, that is a map that people use. Generally speaking, that map is there for a reason. It exists for a reason. Stereotypes exist for a reason. They're not 100%. That's the point. And although if you have to make, like if you're forced to make a snap decision, that map may be helpful. But if you're not forced to make that snap decision, it's probably the wrong one to adopt, I guess. So following that map isn't necessarily the right answer if you're able to stop and see the whole of what's actually going, the reality side of it. I liked kind of he has a lot of quotes in this, and there's a lot of those in this section about reality versus expectations, I guess. And I really appreciated that, because it's true. Like, yes, you can use a map, like driving terrain maps. They're not 100%. If they were, then you would be seeing the actual world at that time. So it's nice that you can use these to help you navigate things, but you also have to keep in mind, like it's saying, the map is not the territory. It's not the real deal. It's just to help you guide you through that real territory.
Yeah, and if you really want to break your brain, he talks about how an ideal map would contain a map of the map, the map of the map of the map, etc. And it would never end. It's kind of like
it's turtles all the way down. Yep.
When you open up screen sharing inside of an application, and then all of a sudden, you see a million different Inception versions of your, yeah. So maps cannot show everything. And because they can't show everything, you have to take into consideration some things about the map. A couple that stood out to me, he mentions reality is the ultimate update. So something may happen in the real world, and obviously the moment that it does, the map needs to be updated in order to be accurate. The map may or may not have that thing on there, and it may be because they haven't updated it, and maybe because they intentionally chose not to include that thing, which is another important thing. Consider the cartographer. I like that phrase. I never really thought of that before, but it's true that the people who make the maps do have an opinion and a bias that they apply to the right way to create that map. Now, for something like a traffic map, we can all agree that those opinions and biases are fine. We want to know the roads. We don't care about all of the colors of the houses that you're passing, but there will be situations when if you were to make the map of the territory, you would make it in a very different way. And I never really questioned a lot of the maps in my life before, but hearing that phrase, I think I'm going to now. And it's not that I'm not going to use them, but I think this is the whole point of this book, is these mental models, this lattice work on which to hang your ideas. When you're presented with a fact, even in like a book that we read, recognize that they are the cartographer in that case, and they're creating this knowledge map in a specific way that benefits them. It may not be exactly what you were looking for. So kind of take it with a grain of salt and err on the side of being skeptical, I guess, or at least question it before just blindly accepting it that, yeah, this is truth.
Funky Mosquito has a good comment here in the chat. It's like any personality test you ever take that gives you feedback on what you are. Like that would fit into it's the creation of a map of you. And when we were talking like map of a map of a map of a map, the more personality tests you take, the more maps you're giving yourself and the more potential views of yourself that you're being offered, I guess, different ways of trying to understand what it is that's happening. So you get these personality tests and you're able to understand what it is that you are. So again, more and more maps mean more understanding, but keep in mind, like you're saying, what is the purpose of that map?
Yep.
If I draw a map with the intent of giving you driving directions, that's going to be very different than if I drew a map for you to give you walking directions. Think of Google Maps. Like they have that. Tick off which mode of transportation are you using, and it's going to change which method or what type of map it's displaying. It's going to tweak it so that it's more appropriate for your purposes. Same thing. If you're just given a map, it's got a bias built into it because it has an intention behind it. And if you question the maker and the purpose of it, you can start to understand where it should or shouldn't be used. I think of like the motivation code that we read.
Yeah.
It told us a lot about ourselves, right? But it's only good whenever we're talking about what motivates us to act. It does absolutely nothing as far as telling me how to focus on the things I'm doing, but it is really good at explaining how I get started doing those things. Like those are two different areas, so I can't use it in one when the other is the intention.
Exactly. The one that comes to mind for me is The Four Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin, which I was not a fan of. And I recognize it's because my mission in taking that assessment did not line up with the cartographers in that particular case.
Right.
And that's completely fine. But that's one instance of me questioning the thing that I was going through just because it didn't quite feel right. But how many times the motivation code, for example, do I just coast through those things and accept it as this is the right thing for this situation? I want to do a better job of questioning those things that, as I'm going through them, which kind of leads into the next one, the circle of competence, because when you're talking about motivation, the Motivation Code by Todd Henry, that's a great place to go because he's an expert in that particular area.
Right.
But you don't want to listen to somebody who's been divorced 5 times about marriage advice.
Yes.
And in this chapter, they explain why you can find yourself in a situation where you do feel like you know everything in a particular area, even when you compare yourself to somebody else. And in the marriage example, when you look at the longevity of somebody who's been married for 50 years, as opposed to somebody who has trouble staying in a relationship for more than a couple of years, from a higher up perspective, it's easy to see, well, I'm going to trust that person. But when you're in the details, it's easy to think, well, I know everything. And so that's what this lifer versus stranger story at the beginning here is all about. They use the analogy of this small town. There's a lifer who lives there. He knows everything about everybody, where they went to school, what their favorite color is, what they ate for breakfast. He knows literally everything. And then this stranger shows up and he gets to meet the mayor and he meets some influential people and he understands some broad concepts about where things are inside of the town. And he's been there a couple of days and he thinks, oh, I know everything there is to know about this town. But if you get them to talk to the lifer for more than 2 minutes, it becomes very clear that you don't know anything. The lifer is the one who has all of the real experience and the real knowledge as it pertains to this thing. And I think it can be difficult to understand when you are a lifer and when you are a stranger. If there's a single takeaway for me from this section, it is to assume that you are the stranger and that you don't know everything and look for the lifers who can help you out with stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Probably a good example of like the whole lifer stranger story in small town. I grew up in small town Missouri, and I remember specifically we had kind of our town festivals once a year in September-ish. And I remember there was a bunch of folks that had come in from out of town and they wanted to go grab something to eat. So they wanted to go to a town that was not too far away. So we were going to go together and they immediately was like, oh, we'll just take the main road and you can follow us and we'll meet you over there. It's like, no, you cannot do that. It's been raining a lot lately. I'm betting there's a lot of water over the road over there. Like, oh no, it's fine. It's like, well, tell you what, we'll meet you there. We're going to go a different way. So me and my friends went and met them there. And of course they show up 20 minutes later than us, even though our way was longer, technically, because it had been raining a lot. And guess what? There's water over the road. So you don't learn those things just from talking to the mayor and coming up and knowing, what you've seen in the tour. You always get the high level. You get the peaks whenever you do the tours. You don't get to see what the depths are down in the valleys and such and what's going on down in the rivers and such. Like, you don't get that detail unless you've been there for a long time. So, yes, I think there's a lot of value in understanding when you are which of those two. If you want to come back to your obsidian example, it's like Mike knew that Git was not his forte.
That's
so
true.
He reached out to somebody who knows it. Like, sure, that's inside my circle of competence. But when it comes to putting together a top-notch screencast, like, I can do that. It's technically like on the outskirts of my circle of competence, but I know Mike is the guy I want to talk to if I wanted some details on that. So we have our own circles that we need to run in, but you have to know when are you in each of those. And I think it's a little bit dangerous when you're not aware or not willing to consider where you are in the midst of that.
I think the warning sign is when you think you know quite a bit about a topic, because he mentions that when you are within a circle of competence, you know exactly what you don't know. And that phrase really struck me. It's really true. I know that I am not a designer.
Right. I'm with you on that one.
I know nothing about colors and fonts and all that kind of stuff. But I know that I don't know that. And so if I'm building a website, I am not going to try to make myself a logo because it's just not going to work. But I think there are definitely times, especially when you get excited about something and you're exploring something, where the tendency can be, okay, well, I guess, I know everything there is to know about this. One example of that, although I don't think I ever got to that point, was with Rome Research, because I went into it thinking, I have no idea how I'm going to use this thing. I'm going to try it this specific way. And then I kind of built on that knowledge. I wonder if it can do this. I wonder if it can do that. And I ended up doing a whole bunch of stuff inside of it. But I still never felt like, okay, I have mastered this application and I can do everything. I know everything it can do. I was completely fine saying I'm going to use it in these specific ways, and the rest of it I just don't even care about.
Right.
But I did that selectively. I wasn't thinking like, well, yeah, this is all the obvious good uses of the tool. There was always in the back of my mind a belief that somebody out there, in fact, when I was on the Rome FM podcast, because they wanted to talk about how I was using it for the sermon notes and the quote book and all that kind of stuff, I was hesitant to go on because I'm like, I don't think I'm using this very well.
Yeah.
And they're like, no, this is really cool. Trust me. I think that's another indication that you are in a circle of competence is you think something's not that great, but other people are telling you, no, actually, this is good. He talks about how there are 3 practices that are needed in order to build a circle of competency. One is a curiosity and it is a desire to learn. That is definitely what I approached that with, but then also monitoring and feedback. So you try something and you see if it worked, and then you even get outside of your own experience and you get somebody else to look at it and say, how would you have done this differently? It's easy to just go into something by yourself, develop whatever you are going to use around that thing in a vacuum, and then get to this point, I think, where you feel you have a circle of competence, but that's just because you haven't expanded your vision beyond your own little circle to see what's really possible. The much safer, better version of this is to assume that you're an idiot and somebody else much smarter knows much more about this. Look for the experts.
This is kind of the difficult thing with being a creator online too, right? We have a tendency to try to make things to share, but we don't always think about what to share until people see something that we've done and like, wait, what was that? What did you just do? Like, I've seen this on the live streams how many times whenever I've done these and I'm showing something on my computer. Like, wait, what did you just do? You jumped over to that. How did you, what just happened? Like, I just typed a text expander snippet. Do you not know text expander? What is this? Like, I don't know why is that such a thing? Like, you just don't realize what it is that you do that other people could find very valuable. And that's because then you start to feel like the whole poser thing. Like, if you think that you're someone who doesn't know a whole lot about something, you could be right, but there's also a decent chance that you know a lot more than you think you do.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic. Let's unpack that for a minute, because I think the difference with that is if you're going to share what you have learned and your experiment publicly, then that's completely cool. But when you try to synthesize whatever you've just learned as this is the way things work,
right?
And I have read this book and I know everything about this topic, and these are the 3 things you need to know, that's when the red flag goes up in my mind. I've probably been guilty of that from time to time.
I have, for sure.
But I try not to do that. I try to filter it as, this is what I did, this is what I learned, this is how I applied it. These are the lessons from this. Take it and try it for yourself. I do try to distill it down so people can grasp it without having to read the whole book themselves.
Yeah.
But I think this is where something like Roma or Obsidian is really valuable, because you're collecting these ideas and you connect them and you let them bounce around, and you've got a unique perspective based on your own bank of knowledge. It's easy to, just operate in the vacuum of the last book that you read. But really the truth is that you are the sum of all of your experiences, all the dots that you've collected. That's really what's producing the output. So just try not to frame it as, trust me, I got this figured out, and just share the insights from the journey. That's my approach to this.
Yep. It's okay to share what you've learned. Just be careful how you share it.
Yep. All right. Next one is first principles thinking. This is probably going to be a short one because essentially what this is saying is that there are principles that everything else is based off of, and constructing your understanding based on these first principles, things that we absolutely know to be true, and filling in from there can help you understand a lot of the root causes and things. So there's a couple different processes they describe in here. One is the Socratic questioning method. I'm not really that interested in this one. The second one, which I'd heard before, is the 5 whys. I assume you're familiar with this one, Joe.
Yeah, why?
Yeah,
that's how I see
basically,
it.
if you're trying to figure out the core motivation for something, you just keep asking why, and then eventually you're going to land at it. I feel like that's a simpler implementation of this first principles thinking. I don't know why they put Socratic questioning first. This one's kind of complicated. There's several steps, and then there's different questions that go along with that. But the basic idea here is that if you understand the principles, then you can change your approach to them. They say it this way: you can change the tactics if you know the principles. And they've got a quote here by Harrington Emerson. It says, as to methods, there may be a million and then some, but principles are few. The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods. The man who tries methods, ignoring principles, is sure to have trouble. And this is the big warning flag from this one, I think. There's lots of stuff out there regarding systems. Now, I love systems. I love systems thinking. Most of the books that we read present a system in some way, shape, or form. But when you combine this with the other principles like the circle of competence and the map is not the territory, I will admit that whenever I pick up a systems book from now on, I'm going to be asking myself, are they building this system and then trying to shoehorn principles into it? Or do they have an understanding of the principles and they've built a system that works on top of that? Because I can think of different examples that fall into each of those categories.
And I would venture to say that the ones that we don't like are the ones that are trying to just make a system works so that they can sell a book. Like that.
Most of them, yeah.
I'm guessing that's part of it. First principles thinking is something, I don't know who would have been the one to make it popular, but I know it's big for Elon Musk. If you're familiar with him, of course, with Tesla, SpaceX, and team. And he, I know, adopts kind of this thing. I don't know which method he comes at this from, but I know that he's spent a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, well, what are the base physics when it comes to battery technology that we cannot break? Or what are those fundamental pieces when it comes to battery technology? And can we alter things without breaking those fundamental physics laws? Like, he likes to go all the way down to that level and then throw out a lot of the assumptions from the general world of technology that we know, the science that we know. He'll throw out a lot of that because he wants to build off of those elemental pieces. I think that's really cool. Obviously, he's had some success doing that. But I think you're right. Like, whenever we approach books or we approach a system, we approach a map, it's good to ask why does this exist? Okay, well, why that, and why that, and why that, and why that? And then you eventually get yourself down to the point where this is the foundation that this is built on. And if you agree with that foundation, awesome. If you don't, you have a problem. And if at some point in the chain it's built on air, then you need to make some adjustments. So I like it. I like the concept, but I don't know how I would come about it other than just be aware of it.
The battery example is a great one because also in this section they say to improve something, we need to know why it was successful or not, which is essentially what you're talking about. They break it down as far as they possibly can, and then they figure out the physics reasons for why they can't make it any smaller, can't cram more battery in there, yada, yada, yada. This also leads into one of these supporting ideas, which comes right after this chapter on falsifiability. This is just a short, like 2-page thing that really is an addendum to this specific chapter in my mind, because this falsifiability, this is being able to prove that something is wrong. And this is important because if you can't prove something is wrong, you really can't prove that it's right either. And they have this falsification definition here, which I liked. This is the opposite of verification. By failing to disprove something, you actually make the argument stronger. And again, I don't have a specific application of that principle, but I do like that one and think that it fits very well with this first principles thinking. I like the way that they organize the content in this book, where they have the 3 general thinking concepts, and they go into that short little section. The next one is thought experiment, and this is kind of exactly what it sounds like. Thought experiments are simply devices of your imagination, which are used to investigate the nature of things. He's got different steps that go into a thought experiment. And really, this is just trying to imagine an alternate reality. One of the phrases from this section that really stood out to me is that creativity is intelligence having fun. I don't know what to do with that statement, but I like it.
Sure.
I do think that, like, I've been thinking a lot about idea management and how we get ideas, how to tie them together, how to make the most of them, how to tell which ones are good, which ones are bad, how to tell the size of an idea. I mean, I don't have specifics for how to do any of this stuff. These are just the questions in my head. The brain is your biological supercomputer. It's pretty impressive. So when it comes to creativity, I do think, though, it is sort of a system. There's an input, there's a process, and then there's output based off of it. And there have got to be levers somewhere that you can pull to make it easier to ideate, to develop. One obvious one is just not constantly being connected, giving your brain time to process things. Like, your ideas come when you're in the shower. Why? Because you're not in the middle of everything else that you got to do during your work day. And I think that when it comes to creating, even though it is a system, it's always felt more enjoyable for me. And I think maybe I've kind of written that off as like, well, that's my personality. I identify as a creator, so that's probably why. But then I get into Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon, and he makes the point that everybody's creative. I heard a story one time, which I really liked, about how when you're born, you get a box of crayons and you have no problem creating. And over time, people tell you to conform, and they tell you to follow processes and think a certain way. And then eventually some people work up the nerve to ask for their crayons back. You know, I feel like that is true of everybody on some level. So I don't think creativity is necessarily like a genetic thing. You're not born a certain way. You're not creative or not creative. I believe everybody has the ability to be creative. They just express it in different ways. So you can apply that here by saying creativity is intelligence. Well, everybody's smart. Everybody's intelligent in different ways. So when you're creating, it's simply activating that intelligence in a specific way that's enjoyable for you, which kind of throws a whole monkey wrench into the thing of, like, don't do what you love, don't follow your passion, but always bring it with you. I don't know. Maybe there's a little bit of truth to that. Maybe it is just your perspective, though, and you lean into your giftings and your talents, and you naturally derive some satisfaction from those sorts of things.
I think you're diving into the territory of trying to define creativity.
Yep.
And I don't think that's a simple thing to do because it really depends on how you want to come at it and what we're talking about when what is the output from the creativity that matters, which is why it's such a nebulous hole that you can't really put your finger on, because it's easy to okay, if we're talking about creativity in the realm of making videos and putting words to a screen, that's one realm of creativity, and the process of being creative in that space has some pretty well-known processes that come with that. And I'm guessing that a lot of your thoughts around idea management and using those to come up with new things are derived around the concept of making things for digital knowledge-based websites, tools, products, files, etc.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of one area. But there's a number of these. Like, we could be talking about creativity when it comes to fine art. Whole different game.
Yep.
The concept of coming up with ideas for fine art, totally different than what you and I would do to write an article or make a video or make a podcast. Like, realms apart from each other. So somebody that comes from the fine art world is going to have a very different perspective on what creativity is than you and I would. So I think that definition is going to change. And I think some of that is because we've expanded what creativity means over time. It used to be, if I'm not wrong here, I believe it used to be primarily just art, like paintings, drawings,
sure,
clay, pottery. It used to be in that realm, and that's what creativity kind of lent itself towards. But then you start getting things like graphic design that takes art and then has a purpose in the world of business and marketing. And now creativity has a whole different life. Like, yes, it's creating things that are beautiful still, but it has a different purpose other than just being fun to look at, cool to look at. So I think it really depends on what you're trying to, like, how you want to define that creativity as far as where in this do you land. But I don't know. There are a lot of different ways you could come at this, for sure.
Yeah, so there's a lot of those things that you mentioned, they kind of could be classified as like left brain or right brain. And I've heard right brain described as the creative side of your brain. I don't think that's accurate. I think you can be creative with the left side of your brain. I am not a artistic person, but I can be creative with words. And I think that the left brain is the one that's kind of driving that a lot of the time. So these different ways of being creative, I guess the question in my head, and I kind of think I know what I think about this, but because creativity can be expressed all these different ways, this thought experiment, what do you see this as like a left brain or right brain activity? I think this is probably a left brain activity in terms of applying mental models. There's kind of a formula implied here. It's not just like grabbing something from the stars and bringing it down into this model. At least that wasn't my interpretation of this. So I guess my big question is, do you think that these thought experiments can be applied in any arena? Because I kind of think they can.
Yeah, I would say so. I don't think when I first came at thought experiment, creativity and like trying to come up with new things wasn't really on my radar. The thought experiment purpose in my mind had more to do with trying to figure out an answer to a problem. And obviously we could say that could be a creative process. The example that came to my head was the process of buying a new house. Okay? It's a thought experiment to put yourself through the paces of, you found a house, it's in a different area, of course, it's got a different layout, it has a different, all sorts of stuff. You bring kids into the mix. What does life look like if you say yes to that house? That's a thought experiment. Let's walk through.
True.
If we said yes here, this is how most people buy a house too. We've done this. This is not an unknown process. If you've bought a house, you've gone into it at some point, you've imagined yourself there, you've thought through the process of, what does breakfast look like? How do I get to work? What is my commute like? How do I get to see family if we can ever go see family again? And all these things are questions and processes that we work ourselves through to determine if it's a yes or no. Now that's I don't want to say it's a simplified, but it is a simplified type of thought experiment per, I think, what he's intending here. But at the same time, I think there's like, yes, that's a very practical way of approaching this. I think what you're getting at, I think, is the in the process of creating content, how does this apply? Because if it's a creative process that we're going through in this thought experiment, how does that come out? And that, I think, actually is more of, I didn't intend this. It's kind of the Gary V document versus create. If you've followed Gary V, he has this whole thing about don't create content, document what you're doing. And if you think that through in what he's intending with that, and if you think about what it is that we do whenever we create things for the internet, a lot of it has to do with showing you what we've learned or what we're doing. Yes, you can make things about new things, idea courses and such, like you could do that. But ultimately, that's because you've been thinking about it.
Yep.
You were talking earlier about you've been thinking a lot about idea management and how we come up with ideas. My guess is you have a lot of ideas around how do people manage knowledge for themselves and interconnect those thoughts externalized.
I'm getting there.
Because you've been thinking about this for a long time. That's the process I think we're talking about. Yep. That's the thought experiment. If I'm thinking through this, what comes out of it?
Yeah, which totally sounds like a left brain activity. And then they make this statement that creativity is intelligence having fun, and it completely destroys the mental model that I had going into this.
But you should also know, like I don't know how far they are down the path, but I think they're slowly abandoning the whole left-right brain thing.
Yep.
Because they're seeing how much it floats from side to side and doesn't actually stick to one side. So I don't know. It's just an easy way to explain it, I think, left and right.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I like the Gary V analogy that you mentioned, document versus create, because you look at somebody who does like a daily vlog. I've watched those before, and I always felt like there's no way I could do that. But for somebody who is just documenting their life, it probably seems very logical how they build one of those, so.
Yeah. Right.
Interesting. All right, let's move on to the next one, which is second order thinking. This is thinking farther ahead and thinking more holistically about things, kind of the effects of the effects. One of the quotes that they have in this section, which I loved, is that stupidity is the same as evil if you judge it by the results. I think that's a great explanation of kind of the second order thinking, or the absence of it, because a lot of times we do things and we don't think far enough ahead, and we don't realize the real consequences of some of these actions. You make the point that a genie never goes back in the bottle. And they have a couple examples here. The one that really stood out to me was this story about antibiotics being used in meat, because initially the antibiotics were producing bulkier, healthier cows. And so they were bringing in more money for farmers, which is a good thing. But the second order effect of this is that you have all of these antibiotics, and so the bacteria that actually survived, this is now resistant to the antibiotics, and that is definitely a bad thing. So should the farmers have known that that was going to happen, that there was that second order effect that was laying out there? I don't know. This kind of gets into an area which I think is a little bit gray, because I think you should be thinking about this sort of stuff, but how do you ascribe any sort of responsibility for these second order effects? Because you can't really know the future. And I guess the big takeaway then, if you accept that, is just hopefully everybody does this.
I think the antibiotic thing is an interesting one to bring up. I don't know if you did that because of my farm background, but the thing that's interesting to me is that in that particular scenario, farmers are not thinking about what's down the line.
Right.
All they know is that if I put antibiotics in the feed for my cattle, if I put hormone supplements in the feed for my cattle, inject them sometimes, it means that the cattle can grow and put on their muscle mass quicker, with less health issues, which means I can make more money for my family and continue to live.
Exactly. And
that is the sum total.
I completely understand that. And you can easily dismiss the second order effect thinking in that scenario, which kind of has me thinking like, well, where do you draw the line? Because you can also take the approach of like, well, in certain situations, they should have known better than to do this sort of a thing.
Right.
I don't know where that line is though.
Yes. I mean, it's messy, right? I mean, there's not a clean line there. And ascribing things to stupidity in that case is absolutely 100% correct because, and in a lot of cases, it's not even stupidity. It's just, I'm allowed to do this. If people don't want to eat the results of what I'm doing, tell them to stop buying it. Like that's a lot of like farmers a lot of times will have that mindset as well. We can get onto them all you want, but stop buying the products of what is being produced from it and then they'll change it. Like until the money doesn't show up, they're not going to do anything. So anyway, that's a whole nother thing. You're stepping on my toes with that one. So like, I'll set that one aside. But it's okay. It's okay. The thing that I think is interesting is we don't often think about, think about it from somebody else's perspective. Somebody makes a decision and it impacts you and you're not happy about the decision that they made because it impacted you. And now I'm upset at them because of that decision, and they've created a lot of pain for me. So obviously they are the culprit here. They are obviously the one who should be at fault here because of so much trouble that they've given to me. The more likely answer is that they weren't even thinking about you.
Yeah, you're getting into another mental model here.
I know. We're diving into like we're starting to like they start to step on each other's toes to some degree. But it's the same concept, right? When you have second and third order thinking, like the results of my decision have to be understood in their entirety before you can actually say, is this the right thing or not? Like this is the problem and the conversation that has to happen a lot when the ethics conversation around self-driving cars comes up. Because what happens if that car, like how do you program that? How is that computer programmer supposed to write the conditional statements that go into that car that decide, do I continue driving straight knowing that I'm going to be in an accident, and if I continue driving straight, I'm going to hit a vehicle and it's going to kill one person? Or, well, say if I keep going straight, it would kill 5 people. Or do I intentionally deviate and kill one person? Or do I leave it on its course to kill 5?
Yeah.
What do you do?
This is the trolley car sidebar they had in this particular chapter.
Yep. So they spell it out in a different way, but I'm just using the self-driving thing because it's more fun for me. But that's the question mark, right? Like, which of those decisions are better? Because now you're choosing between lives. And if the car intentionally chooses to kill the one, as opposed to just staying the course, what do you do? Like, what are the results of that? Now we have to go back to a thought experiment and work through it. Like this is going to get messy, and it's going to get messy fast.
There are no good options. And on the other side of this, I think the other thing here that really stood out to me is they mentioned you have to be careful to avoid the wedge argument or the slippery slope argument, because I've been on the side where, well, I don't want to make a wrong choice. When you're presented with multiple wrong choices, like you were just describing, you don't want to make a choice, so you don't do anything.
Right.
And that's what they're speaking against, is like you can't just sit there and wait till you have all the facts in order to make the perfect decision, because sometimes there isn't a perfect decision to be made. I've definitely been guilty of that before. Analysis paralysis.
It's true.
The next one here is probabilistic thinking. And this we have read books about. Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman is the one that comes to mind. And probabilistic thinking is basically you're trying to estimate using tools of math and logic the likelihood of a specific outcome coming to pass. This is kind of getting into the next book that we're going to be reading,
Right.
which I've started. I think this is going to be really interesting. The future is unpredictable. We don't know all the variables. The best we can do is estimate, and there are certain things that we can use in this mental model to help us estimate better. Again, I don't want to get into a whole bunch of detail here because we could be having the whole thinking fast and slow discussion again. But they talk about a couple of key concepts. The ones that stand out to me are the fat-tailed curves, because everybody has seen like those bell curves. And with the bell curve, they trail off on the ends. But with a fat-tailed curve, basically what they're saying is that unlike a bell curve, there is no cap on these extreme events. So when you think of things in terms of a bell curve, something like median height, for example, there is a maximum for how tall a person can be. Above 8 feet, probably you're not running into anybody at that end of the bell curve.
Right.
But a fat-tailed curve is something like median income, because there can be a whole bunch of people that are in like the tall section of that curve, but way, way on the right side, there are people who have tons and tons and tons and tons of income. And it completely destroys a bell curve model in that scenario. So figuring out, when to use a bell curve versus a fat tail curve, I think is interesting. And this is also where the concept of anti-fragility comes up, which is, and I don't know how to apply this, but this is fascinating to me. But the anti-fragility is basically being able to benefit from those fat tail scenarios that you can't realistically predict. So what does that mean? Well, the example they share is basically never taking a risk that will do you in completely. And the concept of being anti-fragile is that even if you select wrong, you still kind of come out ahead. But I don't know how you apply this personally. When we read that Nicholas, I forget how to say his name. Taleb. Yeah, we read that book. I came across him like, well, this is interesting information, but how in the world do I apply it? I kind of had the same like glossed over approach after reading this chapter. Like, yeah, this all makes sense. You're absolutely right. I don't know what to do with this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Nassim Taleb, anti-fragile is what we're referring to. And it's the concept of, as you are stressed, you are stronger. Like it protects itself from breaking as it's exposed to things that could break it. I think that's a very crude way of explaining it, but that's the concept here. But I don't know. The piece here, probabilistic thinking, like that concept, that model, I suppose I should use his terms, that mental model, he dives into some of this anti-fragile piece, partially because I think as you're thinking about what is the amount of risk involved with making a decision, if that risk is going to completely ruin you, like you were saying, it's probably not the one you want to take. But if it's one that you could benefit from, either in the short term or in the long term, thus the anti-fragile piece, if it's one that could benefit you, then it's a decision to make yes. So that premise of, let me think about what is the probability that something is going to happen in a certain way, and then making that choice depending on if you're willing to take it on or not. Like if there's an 80% chance, you got pretty good chances, jump in. If it's 20%, you might want to stop and reconsider and figure out how to help your chances increase, as opposed to just like, I don't know, seems right, and jumping in. Those of you who do that with the stock market know that you don't get very far doing that.
The hard part with that, though, comes from the supporting idea where you're trying to calculate the percent chances, because they talk about necessity and sufficiency, where having some necessary conditions doesn't mean that you have all the sufficient conditions for a desired event to occur. The example they use is making it to the Fortune 500. Capital is necessary, but not sufficient. If you have capital, you're not necessarily going to make it to Fortune 500. Hard work is necessary, but not sufficient. Intelligence is necessary, but not sufficient. And it can be difficult to know what's necessary and what's sufficient for the outcome that you're trying to get to. So when I read this probabilistic thinking section, I'm like, okay, yep, want to be anti-fragile, want to make right decisions that are going to move me in the right direction, make me stronger anyways. In order to do that, I got to figure out what's necessary, what's sufficient. Forget it.
Yeah.
It just feels like too much of a mental burden at that point.
Right. Which is why it probably only ever comes up at really, really big decisions.
I suppose, yeah.
Because like I'm not gonna go through all of that to figure out, should I upgrade my lighting?
Yep.
I'm just not. I might go through it in the process of buying a house, but even that I'm not sure is worth all of that. Like you're going to do a lot of that intuitively anyway. So probably not even going to do it then.
Which is back to the beginning point of you got to figure out when to use these mental models. But this one in particular, I just had a hard time figuring out when I would use this.
Correct. Yep, I'm with you. Which is where maybe next book would potentially help us with that and figuring out ways to do it at smaller scale. So
yeah, anyway. We're going to play some poker.
All right, I'm game.
All right. The next one here is inversion. And this is basically about thinking about things backwards. You identify and remove obstacles by coming at it from a different direction. This is interesting because they made a comment here that I really liked. Avoiding stupidity is easier than seeking brilliance. So if you are stuck for what is the right thing to do in order to get you where you want to go, start with that. Start with the end in mind, Stephen Covey, and work your way backwards. That's an example of inversion. And they mentioned that Sherlock Holmes was an excellent observer and also a master of inversion. He was able to think about what he wanted to have proven and then set up scenarios which would reveal the facts that he needed in order to make those conclusions, which I think is really brilliant. But again, I'm not really sure when I would use this. They do say at the end, kind of a single line takeaway: when you're stuck, try inversion. But I don't have anything specifically where I would want to use this. I guess I just file it away in the toolbox, and next time I am stuck, I pull this out.
Yeah, I think there's two ways that I see myself putting this one into practice. In the world of programming, this can happen. Like I have a problem that I'm trying to solve. There's a chain of things that has happened up to the point where I have a problem. And it's very easy for me to look at the one closest to my error, the one at the very end. It's easy for me to look there. Whereas sometimes it's better to start back at the beginning, like flip it backwards and walk it from the beginning up to where you're at. So like that one I could see doing that. The other is, they're mentioning chess in the chat. I could see that too. Another one, it's maybe a little bit off from what they intend here, is that you can sometimes take this approach when it comes to defending or supporting your opinions.
Sure.
And what I mean by that is, like, if I have an opinion, fountain pens are better than ballpoints.
That's not opinion, that's fact.
If I want to make the argument in favor of fountain pens, sometimes it's better for me to invert that and try to make the argument against fountain pens, or rather in favor of ballpoints.
Sure.
And if I do that, I can start to get a better understanding of my own opinion there and possibly be able to defend it better. Now, I'm probably not going to go through that process with something like pens, though you would probably argue with me that the value is there. But if it's something much larger, gun control, sometimes it's easier to take the other person's viewpoint and try to defend what they think. It's either going to help you improve your own opinion, or it may make you question it and you may change your opinion.
That's a good example. I hadn't thought of that. I guess I kind of got stuck in their model here, which is where you identify the problem and you define your objective, and then you kind of identify the forces that support and impede that. But I like the idea of taking the other side and trying to falsify basically, those arguments in order to strengthen your own. I can definitely see how that could be a complementary mental model to inversion for sure. All right, next one is Occam's razor. We probably mentioned this one a bunch of times on this podcast because I love this. The version that I'm familiar with, and I say all the time, is that the simplest solution is the best solution. They state it here as simpler solutions are more likely to be right than complicated ones. And they make the point that we all jump to overly complex explanations. If your significant other isn't home when they say they're going to be, you jump to a worst case scenario. That's an example of Occam's razor, when really they probably just got stuck in traffic, forgot to call, whatever. The phrase that they mention here, the quote, which I really liked: when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. I think that illustrates to me my own propensity towards this. And I guess I need to keep in mind Occam's razor more often in terms of like where my mind jumps to for conclusions, and try to push back against that. So a different application than I had applied this before, which was simply, you're figuring out a system with an objective in mind and you try to make it as simple as possible, eliminate all the unnecessary steps. But they're talking about this more in terms of you have an unexpected event occur and you're trying to figure out why that happened, or why there's this gap in the information that you're trying to plug. And don't let your mind, basically control your mind when it tries to think of all those horrible scenarios, which I can totally see value in that from a mental health perspective, let alone a productivity perspective.
This is one that I've seen very recently with like recent tragic events. Like, there are a lot of folks, whenever big tragic events happen, they have some of these elaborate explanations for why it happened. When really, if you look at it, it's actually quite simple. Like, there's really a very basic, straightforward reason for it. And in most cases, the simple explanation is much easier to stomach than the big, complicated mess that you've dreamed up.
Yeah.
Like, think about conspiracy theorists. Like, how many conspiracy theories do you know that are simple? There's a reason it's a theory, and usually it's a conspiracy because it has this big, long, drawn-out thing that you have to follow in order to be able to say that it's true. Like, that's, by definition, it ends up being complicated, it seems. So, thus, they're generally false. So the simplest path is, in most cases, the right answer, but we don't always like to think that way. I like the whole hoof, horse, zebra thing. Like, it makes a lot of sense because it's easy to like, wow, this could be like this. Oh, it could have meant that we didn't go to the moon. It could have meant that we, like, all this stuff. It's like, well, the simplest answer is it is exactly the way you think it happened, the basic way.
I like the conspiracy theory angle that you brought to this, because if I'm honest with myself, if you're in the situation where your significant other hasn't contacted you, they're not home when they're supposed to be, and your brain goes and creates all these worst case scenarios, that is a form of conspiracy theory.
It is.
It's not on the same level as we typically think of when we say conspiracy theory. We're trying to hide something. It's on a national level, yada, yada, yada. But yeah, just don't go there. It's true. And that kind of gets into the last one here, Hanlon's razor. This is my favorite, I think, out of these. Hanlon's razor says that we should not attribute to malice that which is more easily explained by stupidity. And that's a little crass maybe in how it's stated, but it's 100% true. We judge other people by their actions, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. And really we should be giving people the benefit of the doubt. We shouldn't assume that bad results are necessarily the fault of a bad actor. The example they use in this chapter is someone cuts you off in traffic. What do? Do you automatically think, well, they probably just didn't see me? Or do you instantly fly into a rage and like, those jerks, they totally did that on purpose? Even if you don't physically react that way, if you're honest with yourself, there's a little bit of that. Maybe you're able to control it, but it's fascinating and scary to me at the same time that our bodies, our brains naturally go there.
Yeah, I've tried for years to think about things from somebody else's perspective. And this struck me, this has been years ago now, but I had to have an intestinal surgery, which meant that I couldn't lift heavy things. So I couldn't pick up my kids. They were in car seats at the time, which meant my wife had to do it all the time. And it was very common. We would be walking back to a vehicle from, say, going to the farmer's market, and we would get to the door, and I would stop and let my wife put kids in the car. And there were a few times when people would see me do that. And I was thinking at the time, I was like, I'm not a jerk. Like, I can't pick up my kids because of like you, but you don't know this. Like, how do I want to explain it to people? I feel bad because I'm putting something on my wife, and I don't feel that I should be. Ever since that time, I've been trying, and I'm still bad at it, trying to see things from somebody else's perspective. Yes, there may be somebody who cut you off in traffic. Yes, there may be somebody who's doing something that seems to cause a lot of problems for other people or seems to be rude. Why is that? You don't necessarily know the full story. Take the mask thing. Somebody's not wearing a mask in a store. That's the whole political mess we've got now. People shaming because someone else isn't wearing a mask. I have a couple friends that will faint if they put a mask on for more than about 5 minutes because the oxygen is so, like, they're so sensitive to that, they will actually faint. So if you see them in a store, they look fine. If you critique them for not wearing a mask, sure, they'll put it on, but you're going to have to pick them up off the floor here shortly, and then you got an even bigger problem on your hands. So you don't know that whole story. So my judging of that other person is often unfounded because they're not trying to be malicious in many of these cases. A lot of cases, it's just we don't understand. We don't know what's going on. So anyway, that's probably a little bit of a distortion of what they intend by Hanlon's razor, but that's the way I took it.
I think it's accurate though. I mean, really the point they make at the very end is that there are fewer true villains than you suppose. And the big takeaway for me is that when we assume someone's out to get us, we take action to defend ourselves. We don't always want to be playing defense. We don't always want to be responding to perceived threats that aren't really threats.
Right.
Because that can have dire consequences. In fact, they tell a story from 1962 when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were in the middle of the Cold War, that the Americans had informed the Soviets that they were going to drop these charges in these international waters in order to force Soviet submarines to surface. However, the Soviet headquarters did not pass that information along to the nuclear submarines that were in those waters. So there was a nuclear sub that heard this charge go off, and they assume that there's a battle going on, and everybody on the sub wants to fire the nuclear warheads except for one guy. Now, fortunately, they had to all be in agreement or they couldn't fire the missile. But this guy, Vasily Arkhipov, he was aboard this sub when the charge went off. He wouldn't sign off on firing the nuclear torpedo, and they credit him with single-handedly stopping nuclear war. But no one credited him as a hero until the documents were declassified 40 years later or whatever it was. I thought that was fascinating, and instantly I put myself in that situation. Like, how would I have responded?
Right.
I hope that I would have passed the test and not destroyed human civilization. But I can't honestly say
Kill
that.
It's true, but we jump to conclusions so fast.
We do, yeah. And that's kind of the ancillary point here is the causation versus correlation. Don't need to spend a ton of time here. This is pretty straightforward, I think. Just because two things happen and they're correlated does not mean that one caused the other. But again, our brain wants to fill in the blanks and connect all the dots, even if it's in an incorrect way.
I like it. Is that it? Is that all of them?
That's the whole book. We covered it in a record time.
Good job, Mike.
Do you have any action items from this?
Think more?
Yeah.
Maybe this is one of those that's how many books have we had where it's like, this is really good. This is super helpful, but I don't know what to technically, practically do with this. Like, this is a lot of how you think and the way you perceive things. So I don't know what do I write on this outline to act on? I don't know. So no, I don't. Did you figure this out?
I don't have any either. And I think that's okay. They were pretty upfront at the beginning when they said that these are some mental models that can help you make better decisions, see things right, think about things more completely, but it's up to you to figure out when to use them and where. I really appreciated that. And I think that sets the tone for the book itself. And it's very, very different than a lot of the books that we read, which, I mean, in the productivity space specifically, there's a lot of emphasis on like action items and doing something with the information that you've read. And there's reason for that, because an idea is kind of worthless until you act on it. But that's very contradictory to the whole objective of this book. So I don't think it's really set up for any sort of action items.
Sure.
I suppose you could have one if there is one of these mental models that you're just like totally blown away by because it's the first time you've heard it and you're like, I'm going to apply that in this situation. I don't have any of those situations that come to mind, like, oh, I need to apply this Socratic thinking process in this particular scenario. This is all kind of just like nice to know information that I can apply when I need it. But that's why they wrote the book in the first place. So I don't feel bad doing that.
Right. That's kind of what I was thinking. It's like, if you had a big decision you were trying to make or a big problem you're trying to solve, I could see you taking an action of, I'm going to apply X mental model to this situation to try to understand it better so that I can have a better answer on the other end. Like, I could see that.
Yep. But that's really the only place I think an action item would come. Otherwise, it's just kind of reference. And that's completely within the author's original intent, in my opinion, going back to How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler.
Yep.
So, style and rating, I mentioned at the beginning, I love the style of this book. I cannot wait to read the rest of them. And that's because it's really just presenting some information on a lot of concepts that I had known already. As I get into the other volumes and the science and the math, I guarantee I'm going to run into stuff that I don't know anything about, or I learned it maybe when in high school or college, but completely forgot about it. And what I like about this is that they present these models and they present them in a way where it's like, okay, so here's the principle, and you can probably figure out how to use this in a lot of different arenas. So like the science and the math ones in volume 2, for example, you're not just going to be using those models in science and math. And that's really where the value of the models comes from, I think, is figuring out new arenas to use these in an accurate way. Now, you may try something and it's not the right model for the right situation. And so you recognize, well, that wasn't a very great decision, and I'm not going to use that one that way in the future. But this is kind of like a ongoing journey of figuring out when and where to use these. But that being said, like, these models themselves are awesome. They start the whole models section by talking about Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's buddy, who really is talking about the value of these things and how it helps him make right decisions. And when you think about some of those really, really smart people where you're like, how do they make those decisions? How do they do what they do? And maybe they're oversimplifying it in this book, but they're basically saying, well, they've got these awesome models to make these decisions by. I can see that, and I believe that. And so I kind of view, in terms of mental ammunition, for lack of a better term, things that you can use to improve your situation, there is so much value to be had from this book. And the way that they present it is really, really great. The stories, I think, are really good. It's a very interesting book in terms of the visual presentation. Lots of color photos, lots of like pictures of historical and artifacts and things. Like they tell a lot of stories about how these things have been applied historically, and then like the visuals kind of make it more real. It's not overly done, but it's done really well, and it's a very easy read, I feel. The book itself is absolutely beautiful. It's got this cloth cover. It's kind of like the Discipline Equals Freedom book by Jocko Willink that we read, as long as it's not printed upside down and backwards. But yeah, I would recommend this. I would recommend this to anybody. The thing about this is that they give you enough, I think, for these mental models for you to understand them and start applying them right away, without having to go into all of the details. Like I already mentioned, Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow, probabilistic thinking. If you really want to dive into that particular model, there's 400 something pages in that book to scratch that itch for you. But I don't really care for all that detail. I want to know like how it works. The 80-20, maybe that's another mental model for another book. I don't know. But I feel like they do a really good job of delivering just that. So I think this book is a 5-star book. Maybe you go through this and you're like, oh, I already know all this stuff already. But if anybody was going to do that, I feel like you and I are pretty good candidates for falling into that category, because we've read so many books that have spoken to these specific topics. And yet I didn't find myself thinking at any point, oh, I already know this. They present the information in a way where it feels fresh. It feels easy to understand. It doesn't feel overly academic, like over your head, but it also doesn't feel dumbed down and stupefied. I mean, you're thinking about ways that you think. This is a kind of complex topic, but they do it in a way where it's very, very approachable. And I think there's value for anybody who would want to read this book. So well done. 5 stars. Can't wait to read the next one.
Nice. Well, I will echo some of your thoughts. Like the book is just top notch as far as style of printing, as long as it's printed correctly. And like they have these little red card type dividers for each of the new chapters, which makes it very easy to find the next one, which is really kind of cool. I don't think I've run across a book that has a different size page that's a more of a card stock inside of it that's not meant to be torn out. That's just kind of a unique thing. So I love the printing on it. I get that it was originally an ebook, and that's kind of the way that most people would have access to it. I like that they went ahead and did the reprinting of the hardback, though. Definitely a fan of having the printed version of that. I will say that going through this list of mental models, like I'm familiar with Circle of Competence. I've heard that one before. First Principles Thinking, actually studied that one to some degree. Thought Experiments, Second Order Thinking, Probabilistic Thinking, Occam's Razor, Hanlon's Razor. Those are all ones that I have explored, used, been aware of before. The inversion principle and the map is not the territory, those two were, I wouldn't say they were groundbreaking to me, but they were definitely refreshing to have added to this list. It's kind of cool to see this whole list and work through it. Like you were saying, we've read how many books about things around this now that you would think that even though like I've gone through 7 of the 9 here, and yet this was as if I was learning about it the first time. Like it was the way it's written and the way it's explained is very unique. Even if you understand what Occam's Razor is, you're still going to pick up a lot from reading this. If you're very familiar with how First Principles Thinking works, you're still going to get some value from going through this. And it's written, again, very well. Like you were saying, it's easy to read. So I appreciate that. I didn't feel like I was dredging along through this one, trying to get through it and just hoping to be done. No, it was an easy read. It was an entertaining read too because of the stories involved and the explanations of those. I'll join you at 5.0. I think it fits that. Even though we don't have action items from them, and I know that that's a thing that we generally would require when we get up in the 4.5s and 5.0s. Like that's generally something, like it has to impact us enough to make us want to do something. I get that it doesn't really fit that, but at the same time, I know for a fact that this is going to change the way that I view so many things. Already has. So very grateful for having read this. Highly recommend it. I don't know when I'm going to read the next ones, but I need to at some point because this was top notch. So very grateful for having gone through this. So good choice, Mike.
Good choice, Martin McGowan, who originally recommended this in the Bookworm Club many moons ago when the hardcover was not available.
Sure. Good job. So,
all right, so we'll put Great Mental Models on the shelf. What's next?
We're going to dive into one of these mental models a little more, I think, by going through Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. I know that she has a follow-up on this. If I understand things correctly, that follow-up is more of a workbook type scenario. It's similar to Willink's Discipline Equals Freedom, where it's more of a handbook, a manual of sorts to implement. So it's, if I understand it right, that's what the newest one is that recently came out. So I kind of want to go through this one, have some thoughts on what we maybe could do with the next one, but I've not had a chance to talk through that with Mike, so I'm not going to say anything. So Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, that's the one that we're going to cover next time.
All right.
And
when we went through the organized writer, we kind of glossed over the whole email section. You made a comment, though, about making tasks out of emails. And I feel like now is the perfect time to revisit the topic because our buddy Cal Newport has a new book out. I say buddy because he's an aspirational buddy. I would love to.
And we've done everything he's written except one,
Big
I think.
Fan of Cal Newport. But he's got a book coming out, A World Without Email, which is being released as we record this. It's going to be released March 2nd, Amazon says. So that will give us a little bit of time before we have to record it. But I have been looking forward to this book. I know some people who got advanced copies of this book, and they said it's very good.
I'm approaching this one as a skeptic.
Yeah, I figured you might be. If there's one book where Joe's going to disagree with Cal Newport, it may be this one.
This might be it. It's true. So true. Generally, I love his stuff, so I've been very hesitant on this one. From the day I heard about it, it's like, oh no, he went there.
Yep. Which you knew he was going to after Digital Minimalism.
At some point, yeah. It's true. All right. Thinking in Bets, A World Without Email. You doing anything in the meantime?
I am not. How about you?
I am not either.
All right.
Life. It happens.
It does happen. I have a sabbatical coming up, so maybe I will crank through a book during sabbatical, and I'll share that next time, but no promises. I may just be recreating text files inside of Obsidian instead.
Sure.
All right. So thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you specifically to our paying Bookworm Club premium members. If you want to support the show, you can do that by tapping on the little icon inside of Overcast or by going to club.bookworm.fm/membership or just bookworm.fm/membership. There are a couple perks that you get if you decide to support the show, but really it just means a lot to Joe and myself. It helps us keep the lights on, pay for the hosting, things like that. So thank you to everybody who was willing to throw some money our way in order to keep the show going. It means a lot to us.
Huge thanks to you folks. We certainly couldn't do this without all the support that you guys give us. So super grateful for everyone who's chosen to join that membership. So for those of you who are watching us live, thank you for doing that. If you're interested in doing that in the future, bookworm.fm/live. We'll take you where you need to be. And if you're reading along with us, Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, and we'll review that one in a couple weeks.